What if I told you that modern man would not survive a single night in the conditions of that winter? Imagine a steppe where the wind howls so fiercely that it tears off roofs and the temperature drops to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. In such conditions, when even the mercury in thermometers froze, the pioneers of the Wild West managed not only to survive, but also to sleep in relative warmth. Their homes were windswept huts, and their heating was primitive and unreliable. But they had a system honed by years of harsh experience and passed down from neighbor to neighbor. These people did not have access to central heating, electric blankets, or synthetic insulation. They used the laws of physics, the properties of natural materials, and the heat of their own bodies, turning bedtime preparations into a complex ritual of survival. Every mistake in this ritual could cost the health and often the lives of the entire family. Watch the video to the end to find out how an ordinary brick became a settler's best friend and why snow piling up to the roof was not a curse, but a salvation. Want to know a secret that will change your idea of comfort? At first glance, it seems that the stove is the main source of heat in the house, but in fact, it was the walls themselves that provided the basis for protection. They were the first barrier between the sleeping family and the cold night. On the Great Plains, where the weather could change rapidly, this was crucial. Many settlers understood that without reliable walls, no stove could save them. Therefore, they were very careful in choosing materials. The first and most important barrier between the sleeping family and the deadly cold was the walls of their home, and often these walls were made not of wood, but of the earth itself. In places where there were almost no trees, the earth became the only building resource. Settlers cut sod with knives or special plows, creating dense bricks interwoven with the roots of steppe grasses. These roots bound the blocks together and made the walls surprisingly strong. This material was affordable, free, and easy to work with. Thanks to this, construction did not require much experience. On the Great Plains, where trees were rare, settlers built houses out of sod, cutting bricks from the dense steppe soil, intertwined with grass roots. The sod was removed in long strips and cut into equal blocks so that the walls would be even. These bricks were laid in layers, carefully pressed against each other. Sometimes the work took only a few days. The house turned out to be low but very strong. And most importantly, it kept the heat in perfectly. These dugouts, or sod houses, had phenomenal thermal insulation properties that are unattainable for many modern materials. The thick walls, almost a meter wide, worked like a giant thermos. During the day, they accumulated solar heat and kept it inside. At night, the house cooled down very slowly, even if the temperature dropped sharply. The wind could not find any cracks through which the cold could penetrate. Therefore, such housing was considered extremely practical. The thick walls, almost a meter wide, acted like a thermos, storing the heat accumulated during the day and slowly releasing it at night. Even a strong gust of wind could not penetrate this mass of earth. Unlike wooden huts where heat escaped through cracks, sod houses remained stable in temperature. The house maintained an internal microclimate that helped people live more comfortably. Even in harsh winters, such dwellings were more reliable than many more modern structures. This made them especially valuable to the first settlers. The wind capable of blowing through a wooden hut through the smallest cracks was powerless against the monolithic mass of earth. Powerful winter storms that knocked down fences and roofs had almost no effect on sod houses. The earth dampened the sound and movement of the wind, creating a feeling of security inside. Many were surprised at how quiet such a dwelling was. Even small children could sleep peacefully without being awakened by the noise of the elements. The walls seemed to isolate people from the outside world. Inside such a house, the temperature always remained above freezing, even when an Arctic storm raged outside. People could wake up in the morning and feel that the fire had gone out during the night, but the air remained warm. This gave them confidence that their family would not freeze in their sleep. But this type of house also had disadvantages that could not be ignored. The earthen walls often crumbled, falling off in small pieces. Sometimes this happened right on the table or on the bed. The earthen walls constantly crumbled, creating dust, and during rains the roof could leak, turning the floor into a dirty mess. Moisture easily passed through the upper layers of turf if they were not laid properly. Settlers had to regularly repair the roof to prevent it from collapsing. After heavy rain, the water dried slowly, creating dampness. In winter, this turned to ice and made life difficult. Despite these difficulties, people lived in such houses for years. To improve insulation, the pioneers hung old blankets, bison hides, or newspapers glued with flour paste on the interior walls. Any available material was turned into an extra layer of protection. This reduced drafts and increased comfort. Sometimes the walls were decorated with colorful scraps of paper to make the dwelling less gloomy. Such decoration seemed simple, but it brought tangible benefits. Life became a little more comfortable. Each layer of paper or fabric created an additional air gap that trapped precious heat inside the room. People noticed the difference almost immediately after insulation. The house became quieter, softer, and warmer. These measures helped to endure even the long, frosty months. In the fall, families stocked up on any materials they could use. It was their way of preparing for winter. Windows were the most vulnerable spot in the defense against the cold, as the glass froze instantly. In small windows, an icy crust formed within an hour after sunset. Therefore, windows were always closed before bedtime. Some families even made double frames to retain more heat. But this method required extra materials, which were often in short supply. Therefore, other solutions had to be found. At night, they were tightly closed with heavy wooden shutters or covered with thick quilted blankets to minimize heat loss. The blankets served as an additional barrier against the cold. When the cold was really bad outside, people would plug up any gaps with rags and old clothes. This helped keep the warm air inside the house. When the wind was really strong, the windows became the main battle zone for keeping the heat in. Every inch needed attention. The door, often made of rough planks, also required special attention and additional insulation. Drafts tended to penetrate through it. To prevent this, people placed long fabric rolls filled with sand or sawdust on the threshold. They fit snugly against the board and prevented cold air from entering the house. A heavy bison hide was hung on top. It served as an additional curtain. The threshold was covered with fabric rolls stuffed with sand or sawdust to stop the draft coming in through the floor. These rolls sometimes had to be replaced if they got wet, but even when wet, they helped retain heat better than bare wood. The hide on the door reduced heat loss and made the house quieter. This improvised vestibule was a simple but effective solution. Settlers used it almost everywhere. The floor in such houses was most often earthen, tamped down to the hardness of stone. Over time, it became almost smooth, but the cold from the frozen ground still penetrated upward. Therefore, the floors were covered with straw or fabric rugs. This made the house warmer and more pleasant. The rugs absorbed moisture and provided additional insulation. To keep feet warm, they were covered with a thick layer of straw or woven rugs made of rags. The straw helped to retain heat and soften the floor surface. Sometimes it was changed several times during the winter to avoid dampness. The mats were made from old clothes cut into strips. This added a little color and comfort to the house. Such solutions helped to survive the harshest cold. In wooden log cabins, which were built in wooded areas, the main task was to caulk the gaps between the logs. Even a new building required careful inspection. Moss, clay, or a mixture of mud and straw was packed into each gap. It was a laborious task, but without it, it was impossible to survive the winter. Loose joints let the cold in instantly. Therefore, preparations for winter began long before the first frosts. We would love to hear your opinion. Could you spend the winter in a house built of grass and earth to keep warm? Write about it in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about survival.
The settlers have no choice but to rely on their resourcefulness to make it through the long winter months.
Guess what happened next when it turned out that there was no firewood? There were no forests on the vast prairies, and the usual firewood was an unaffordable luxury. Settlers had to be incredibly inventive to find fuel for their stoves and hearths. The main source of heat was bison chips, sun-dried bison or cow dung. This fuel burned with an even hot flame, similar to smoldering peat, and gave off a surprising amount of heat. Collecting this fuel was a never-ending task for the whole family during the warm season in order to ensure supplies for the winter. Another common option was dry grass, or hay tightly twisted into bundles. There were even special stoves designed to burn hay, called grass burners. However, the grass burned instantly, and new bundles had to be constantly added to keep the fire going. Corn cobs left over after shelling the grain were also used and valued for their ability to produce quick and intense heat. In the most desperate situations, when supplies ran out, even furniture or parts of farm buildings could be thrown into the stove. But this was a last resort, meaning that the situation had become critical. The stoves themselves, often cast iron potbelly stoves, were the heart of the home and the center of the universe during the winter months. They heated up faster than old fireplaces and used fuel much more efficiently. The surface of the stove was used not only for cooking, but also for heating water, which increased humidity and made the air warmer. At night, people tried to preserve the stove so that it would give off heat for as long as possible. To do this, they put the largest pieces of fuel in the firebox or packed it tightly with coal if it was available. The air vents were closed almost completely, switching the combustion to a slow smoldering mode. Despite all the tricks, by morning the stove inevitably cooled down and the temperature in the house dropped rapidly. The hardest part was getting out from under the blankets in the pre-dawn darkness to rekindle the fire. Whoever took on this responsibility performed a real feat for the sake of the rest of the family. Life bustled around the stove until bedtime. Clothes were dried here, stones for the bed were heated, and people simply sat, soaking up the warmth. The further away from the stove, the colder the air became, and the corners of the room were often covered with frost. The space in the house was clearly divided according to temperature. The art of controlling fire was as important a skill as shooting or plowing the land. It was necessary to know exactly how much fuel to put in so as not to suffocate, but also not to freeze. This balance between warmth and safety was maintained every night. But even the hottest stove could not warm a person in an icy bed. How did they solve this problem? Are you ready to learn the truth about what the pioneers actually slept on? A settler's bed was not just a place to rest, but a complex engineering structure designed to retain heat. The basis of it all was a feather bed, a huge mattress stuffed with goose or duck down in feathers. This item was the most valuable possession of the housewife and was often passed down as the greatest treasure. The down created an incredibly effective air cushion that retained body heat better than any modern synthetic material. Sinking into a high feather bed, a person felt as if they were in a warm cloud, isolated from the cold outside. If there were not enough feathers, mattresses or tiki were stuffed with corn husks, straw, or dry moss. Corn husks were noisy and rustled with every movement, but they retained their volume well and did not clump together. Straw had to be changed every season as it turned into dust over time. An important secret was that cold penetrated the bed not only from above, but also from below. Therefore, another coarser mattress stuffed with straw or old rags was often placed under the main mattress. This created an additional barrier between the sleeper and the cold floor or wooden bedboards. On top of the feather bed, they laid a layered pie of blankets, hand-sewn from scraps of woolen fabric. Patchwork quilts, or quilts, were not just decoration, but heavy armor against the cold. The heavier the blanket, the tighter it pressed the feather bed to the body, preventing warm air from escaping. On the coldest nights, heavy bison hides or bear skins were thrown over all the blankets. The fur created an airtight layer, working on the principle of a living animal's skin. It was difficult to turn over under such weight, but the temperature inside remained tropical. Beds were often equipped with thick fabric canopies that were closed at night. This created a room within a room whose microclimate was warmed by the breath of sleeping people. The temperature inside the canopy could be 10 degrees higher than in the rest of the room. Every morning, the feather bed had to be fluffed to restore its airiness and thermal insulation properties. Compressed down lost its ability to retain heat, so this ritual was essential. It was hard physical work, but the comfort of the next night depended on it. Pillows were also stuffed with feathers and made large enough to cover the shoulders and ears. The head was the only part of the body in contact with the cold air, so they tried to drown it as much as possible in soft warmth. Sleeping in such a bed gave a feeling of complete security, even when the wind outside tried to tear the roof apart. Don't forget to like this if you would like to try sleeping on a real down feather bed. What if I showed you a device that replaced the battery for the pioneers? In order not to lie down in an icy bed and waste precious calories warming it with their bodies, the pioneers used external heat sources. The simplest and most common means were ordinary stones, bricks, or pieces of soapstone. These items were placed on the stove or near an open fire all evening, heating up to a high temperature. Soapstone was particularly valued because it had unique heat capacity and could give off heat for many hours. It was a natural battery, available to everyone. Before going to bed, the hot stone was wrapped in several layers of thick flannel or wool. This was done to prevent it from burning the bedding and the feet. The bundle was placed at the foot of the bed under the blanket a few minutes before going to bed. The feeling of feet touching the warm bundle in an icy room was one of the main pleasures of the harsh life on the frontier. The heat from the stone slowly spread upward, creating a cozy zone of comfort. By morning, the stone had cooled down, but by that time, the bed had already been warmed by the heat of the human body. Wealthier families used special copper hot water bottles, pans with long handles and lids. Hot coals from the stove were poured into such a hot water bottle and quickly moved between the sheets. This allowed the bed to be dried and warmed instantly, but required caution so as not to leave burn marks. Women often used heavy cast iron irons, which were also heated on the stove. The iron wrapped in a towel was placed in the center of the bed to warm the mattress. Its massive metal sole retained the heat of the dying fire for a long time. Small bags filled with heated grain, salt, or sand were also used, which worked like a dry, hot water bottle. They were softer than stones and molded better to the shape of the body, which made them more comfortable. Such a bag could be placed on the chest or pressed against the back. Sometimes glass bottles or ceramic jugs filled with hot water were used. However, in severe frost, the cork could fly out or the vessel could crack, which threatened to wet the bed. A disaster in sub-zero temperatures. Therefore, dry heat sources were preferred. For many children, it was their duty to warm the beds of older or sick family members with their own bodies. But more often than not, it was inanimate objects, stones and irons, that took the brunt of the cold. It was simple physics in the service of human comfort. I wonder how the pioneers dressed to preserve this precious warmth. Sleepwear on the frontier bore little resemblance to modern lightweight pajamas or nightgowns. It was real equipment designed to retain as much heat as possible. The main material was flannel, a soft, fleecy cotton or wool fabric. Men and women often slept in the same underwear they wore during the day, long woolen underwear and shirts. Changing clothes in a freezing room was not only unpleasant, but also dangerous to health. No one wanted to expose their body to the cold unnecessarily. Long nightshirts made of thick flannel, reaching down to the feet, were worn over the underwear. The air trapped between the layers of clothing served as an excellent insulator. The more layers were worn, the less chance there was of waking up from shivering. An essential part of the nighttime wardrobe was a nightcap for men and a bonnet for women. The pioneers knew what doctors confirm today. A huge amount of heat is lost through the head. Sleeping with your head uncovered in a room where the temperature could drop below zero was fraught with illness. Thick knitted wool socks were worn on the feet, sometimes 2 pairs at once. Cold feet made it difficult to sleep, so special attention was paid to keeping them warm. Often these socks were specially knitted from coarse but very warm yarn specifically for sleeping. An important rule was to make sure that clothes were dry. If underwear became damp from sweat during the day, it had to be changed despite the cold. Moisture was the best conductor of cold and the main enemy of survival. The clothes that were planned to be worn in the morning were placed under the blanket or hung on the back of the bed under the canopy. This allowed people to put on warm clothes in the morning rather than frozen fabric that resembled tin. Such foresight saved the body's energy. On particularly cold nights, they could wear outer garments such as vests or shawls over their nightclothes. People looked like cabbage heads wrapped in endless layers of fabric. Appearance did not matter. The main goal was to stay alive. Even hands were often hidden under a blanket or covered with light mittens if they had to be exposed. Fingertips froze first, signaling that the temperature in the room was dropping to critical levels. This whole clothing system was the last line of defense if the fire went out and the blankets weren't enough. It allowed a person to survive the night even if the house was freezing through and through. Ready to learn a secret that would seem wild to modern people? In extreme cold, concepts of personal space and privacy took a back seat. The most effective and reliable source of heat was the living human body, and the pioneers used this resource to its fullest. During the winter months, communal sleeping was practiced, with several family members sleeping in the same bed. It wasn't a matter of cramped quarters, it was a survival strategy. Bodies pressed together created a common thermal contour that was much easier to maintain than the warmth of a single person. Children were usually placed in the middle, between adults, where it was warmest. The youngest were given the safest place in the nest. Adults protected them from the cold air coming from the edges of the bed with their backs. Sometimes the whole family, including grandparents, could sleep in one huge bed made up of several beds. This was called bundling, an old tradition that came from Europe. The more people there were under the blanket, the higher the temperature inside. Even guests caught in bad weather could be invited to share the family bed if there was no other place to stay. In the harsh conditions of the frontier, refusing to let someone in to keep warm could mean a death sentence for them. Moral standards adapted to the cruel reality of nature. This method of collective heating saved blankets and fuel. Instead of heating 2 rooms or warming 3 different beds, all resources were concentrated in one place. It was simple survival arithmetic. Animals such as dogs or cats were also often allowed into the house and even onto the bed at the foot. Their body temperature is higher than that of humans, and they acted as living hot water bottles. A good hunting dog at the foot of the bed could warm you better than any brick. In the morning, when one person got up to light the stove, the others tried to close ranks to preserve the remaining heat. The place of the departed was immediately taken by another, preventing the cold from penetrating under the blankets. This forced closeness strengthened family ties, even though it was born out of necessity. People physically felt each other's support in the struggle against the elements. Loneliness in the winter prairie was not just sad, it was cold. But how did the pioneers prepare for the morning when they had to leave this warm refuge? When real blizzards began, the pioneers did what many today would find illogical. They did not clear the snow from the walls of their houses, but instead tried to pile it up in a thick layer. The wind helped them in this, creating snowdrifts that provided additional protection. Snow filled with air worked as an excellent heat insulator. It trapped warm air inside and blocked gusts of wind. This was a natural extension of the pioneers' relationship with nature. They used all of its properties to survive. Snowdrifts swept up by the wind were used as an additional layer of external insulation. This solution did not come from theory, but from observations of how animals survive the cold. People noticed that animals used snow as shelter and adopted this practice. It turned out that the weather itself provided them with protection. In harsh winters, a snow cushion was crucial. It could keep a few extra degrees of heat inside the house. Snow, which consists mainly of air, is an excellent heat insulator. Its structure creates many small chambers in which air stagnates. This makes snow almost as effective as modern insulation materials. Without scientific explanations, people simply knew that it was warmer this way. They trusted the experience of their ancestors and their own feelings. It was this knowledge that helped the settlers survive without sophisticated tools. Settlers deliberately built snow fences or laid straw sheaves along the outer walls to trap snow. The straw held the snowdrifts in place and prevented them from sliding down. The house gradually sank into a white cocoon that protected it from the piercing winds. From the outside, such dwellings looked unusual, but inside they became much quieter. The sounds of the blizzard were muffled by the walls of snow. People felt like they were in a kind of winter fortress. The house, buried in snow up to the windows, resembled a den, but inside it became noticeably warmer. Any cracks in the lower part of the log house ceased to be a problem. The wind could not get inside, and the warm air layer between the snow and the logs remained for a long time. This made heating more efficient, even with small supplies of firewood. The internal microclimate became more stable. Families felt more secure. The wind stopped blowing heat out through the gaps at the bottom of the house, and the dwelling had a chance to retain it longer. It was this effect that was the key to survival on the plains. In places where a single gust of wind could lower the temperature in the house by several degrees, the snow wall became a lifesaver. Even if the stove went out at night, the heat lasted longer. This reduced the risk of hypothermia. Thus, nature became an ally. This banking method was an essential part of preparing for winter. It was used by both experienced settlers and newcomers. It was passed down from family to family as a proven solution. In winter, no one ignored such protection. It was part of the general culture of survival. People understood that frost left no room for error. Not only snow was used, but also manure, earth, or old leaves. It all depended on what materials were available. It was important to create a dense barrier around the foundation. The lower part of the house always suffered the most because the cold accumulated near the ground. Any natural material that retained air was suitable. Pioneers valued practicality over aesthetics. The main task was to cover the foundation and the lower crowns of the house, where the cold penetrated most often. If these areas remained open, all other insulation was meaningless. Even a small flow of cold air could quickly cool the entire house. Therefore, in the fall, families checked the condition of the lower logs especially carefully. Sometimes they reinforced them with additional layers of clay. This reduced drafts and protected the wood. Inside the house, rolls of twisted carpets or bags of rags were also placed on the floor along the walls. They served as an internal line of defense against the cold. They were made from any fabric that could hold its shape. These rolls were often used for years, with only the filling being changed. They prevented cold air from moving along the floor. This had a noticeable effect. It blocked the cold air that flowed down the walls. This maintained a more uniform microclimate. People fought for literally every degree. In homes with children, such protection was especially important. The heat was retained longer, and the floors became less icy. Even small efforts brought noticeable results. The struggle was for every centimeter of the perimeter that could let in the cold. People studied their homes as if they were living organisms. They remembered where they were weakest and where leaks appeared. Over time, bolsters and other methods became familiar details of everyday life. There was always room for insulation in the house. This is how a culture of constant care for the home was formed. In the attic, if there was one, a thick layer of sawdust or dry leaves was scattered. This was the most effective insulation for the roof. Since heat rises, it was the upper part of the house that needed special attention. If it was not insulated, the warm air would escape instantly. Therefore, the attic often became the main focus of preparation. Sawdust retained heat better than many other materials. Heat rises, and without good roof insulation, all heating efforts would be in vain. The roof was a kind of cap for the house, which had to keep the precious heat inside. The thicker the insulation layer, the more stable the temperature became. Settlers checked the roof several times per season. Lightweight materials were easy to carry and add as needed. This became part of the winter routine. The entrances to farm buildings and cellars were also covered with snow or hay bales. This protected tools, food, and animals. In severe frosts, any warmth was valuable. Cellars could freeze if left unprotected. Snow helped keep them above freezing. Thus, the entire yard was transformed into a network of insulated passageways. Sometimes the snow covered the house so much that they had to dig a tunnel from the door to the outside. This made it feel like the family was living underground. But inside, it remained warm and quiet. Such a tunnel served as additional protection from the wind. It reduced heat loss when the door was open. The frost did not penetrate inside so quickly. It created a surreal feeling of a winter burrow, but it was this snow cocoon that saved them from the deadly winds. On the plains, the wind was more dangerous than the cold itself. It penetrated clothing and walls if it let up. Therefore, snow tunnels were seen as a blessing. People were calm about them. It was part of winter life. Winter was a time when the house became one with the landscape. The winds, snow, and cold became part of the dwelling itself. Man and nature entered into a kind of cooperation. This was the only way to survive on the open plains. Every house became a fortress, and every fortress was held together by snow and people. The most honest indicator of the night's cold was a bucket of water standing in the kitchen. It silently recorded the temperature better than any words or stories. The pioneers were accustomed to looking at this bucket as a thermometer that never lied. If the water was covered with ice, it meant that the night had been particularly harsh. Sometimes the ice was so thick that it seemed as if the bucket had been standing outside. This reminded people how fragile their protection from the cold was. It was common for the pioneers to wake up and find that the water in the bucket had frozen to the bottom or turned into a massive ice cylinder. On such mornings, there was no doubt that even inside the house, the temperature had dropped below zero. No stove could keep the heat in all night if the wind was particularly fierce. Sometimes the ice crust glistened in the morning light like a small iceberg. And this sight greeted people even before they went outside. The house and the street seemed almost the same in temperature. The morning ritual began with the head of the family breaking the ice with a poker or knife handle to get water. The sound of cracking ice echoed through the house and woke everyone else. It was a kind of signal that a new day had inevitably begun. No one was surprised by this sound. It was part of the usual winter routine. The broken ice was placed nearby to melt by the stove. This is how almost every winter day began. The sound of cracking ice was an alarm clock for everyone in the household. People got up reluctantly, but they understood that there was no time to delay. Work was waiting, and the cold left no time for reflection. Even the children knew that the morning began with an icy blow to the bucket. It created a sense of a shared start to the day. Everyone understood that long hours of worry and labor lay ahead. Even after breaking the ice, the water for washing remained freezing cold. It burned the skin so sharply that it took one's breath away. But that was exactly what helped to wake up completely. Washing was quick and decisive, without unnecessary movements. No one lingered at the wash basin for more than a couple of seconds. The cold forced them to move quickly. Even though it was liquid, the water felt like a test for the body. The skin instantly turned red, and the hands went numb. But people did not complain. They accepted it as part of winter. Such washing was more invigorating than any coffee. It instantly awakened attention and strength. It was both unpleasant and useful. Sometimes even food in the cupboards would freeze. Milk would turn into blocks of ice, and bread would become as hard as a rock. Housewives knew in advance that they would have to spend a long time defrosting food in the morning. They would place dairy products closer to the stove to give them a chance to warm up. Bread had to be literally chopped with a knife to cut off a piece. Eggs could burst from the cold, and that was a real loss. Such work required constant planning. The housewife had to think about breakfast in advance because everything thawed differently. Sometimes the food thawed unevenly, and they had to wait even longer. People understood that frost could spoil even the simplest dishes. Therefore, many prepared warm food in advance, leaving it in pots next to the stove. This saved time in the morning. But even so, the food did not always retain the desired softness. On such mornings, people's breath turned into thick steam. Every word was accompanied by a white cloud, as if the family were talking not in the kitchen, but in the winter air. This effect reminded them that it was almost as cold inside as it was outside. Sometimes the steam rose so thickly that it seemed as if the room was filled with fog. Small children played, exhaling clouds and drawing with them in the air. But adults knew that this was a sign of insufficient heat. The walls could be covered with a thin layer of frost, which melted when the stove was lit. When the frost turned into water droplets, the floor began to get wet. The house became damp and musty, but people had no way to prevent this process. It was a natural result of the severe nighttime cold. People simply got used to such phenomena. Getting dressed turned into a real race. You had to jump out of your warm bed and put on your clothes in a matter of seconds. If you delayed, your body would quickly lose the heat it had accumulated. Movements became quick and sharp. No one sat around thinking about what to wear. Decisions were made instantly. Getting out of bed was the hardest part of the morning. The cold enveloped the body, causing it to flinch in surprise. But after a couple of minutes, the body got used to it. People understood that the main thing was to start moving. Movement restored warmth faster than a stove. Therefore, everyone tried to be active from the very morning. Metal objects, door handles, tools, dishes, burned their hands with cold. They became so icy that it was scary to touch them. People often used rags or mittens to avoid feeling the cold. If you accidentally grabbed something with your bare hand, your fingers would instantly go numb. Metal was merciless in the cold. That's why people treated it with caution. Touching metal with a wet hand could cause the skin to freeze. It was dangerous and very painful. Children were always warned to stay away from metal objects in the morning. Even accidental contact could cause serious pain. Sometimes it was necessary to warm the stuck skin with warm water. Such cases were never forgotten. The ice in the bucket was just a fact, not a tragedy. It meant that it was time to hurry up and light the stove. This simple signal started the whole daily routine. People learned to read such signs as confidently as a book. They knew that cold was not an enemy, but only a condition that had to be taken into account. I wonder how they coped when the weather became truly dangerous. When a real blizzard descended on the plains, visibility dropped to zero. Leaving the house even for a couple of meters meant risking your life and losing your bearings in the white fog. To avoid getting lost in their own yard, the pioneers stretched ropes from the door of the house to the barn. This rope was the only thread connecting them to their farm and animals that needed feeding. People held on to it with a death grip as they made their way through the wall of snow and wind. Letting go of the rope meant disappearing into the white chaos, possibly forever. There were cases when people froze to death 10 steps from their own porch, unable to find the entrance. Therefore, during blizzards, safety rules were observed with fanatical strictness. No one went outside alone without insurance. Sometimes, anticipating a long storm, the pioneers would bring their most valuable animals, calves, piglets, or chickens, right into the house. This saved the livestock from freezing and added a little living warmth to the room. The smell was terrible, but the choice was between comfort and the survival of capital. Supplies of firewood and food were moved closer to the door or into the porch so that no one had to go far. The house went into autonomous fortress mode, ready for a long siege. The windows were curtained even more tightly, and lights were turned on only when necessary. Days merged into nights as there was a constant gray haze outside. The family spent their time reading the Bible, mending clothes, or simply talking amid the howling wind. The psychological strain of isolation and the roar of the storm was enormous. During such periods, sleep became the main way to conserve energy and pass the time. People could sleep 12 to 14 hours a day, sheltered in their warm nests. It was a kind of winter hibernation that allowed them to wait out the raging elements with minimal effort. If the fuel ran out during a blizzard, the family would go to bed and not get up for days, warming each other with their bodies. This was the last line of defense. As long as they were together under a mountain of blankets, they had a chance. The rope tied to the porch remained a symbol of connection to the outside world, which had temporarily disappeared. It was a reminder that somewhere out there was a barn, livestock, and work to return to when the wind died down. Surviving one such night was a feat, but the pioneers lived like this for months, year after year. Their bodies gradually became accustomed to the low temperatures, and even brief periods of warmth were perceived as a luxury. Their metabolism worked differently, forcing the body to produce more energy. What seems like an extreme situation to modern people became a normal way of life for them. Winters taught people that strength comes not from comfort, but from constant adaptation. And every year their resilience only grew. Their bodies adapted to the cold, and the very concept of warmth became much broader. Pioneers learned to conserve energy, save every extra movement, and move in such a way as not to lose heat. They knew how to shelter themselves, how to dry their clothes, and how to distribute work so as not to get cold. These skills did not come from books, but from repeated experience. And with each season, they became part of their instinct. Such upbringing made people extraordinarily resilient. Psychological resilience was no less important than warm blankets and hot food. Long months in a confined space could break even a strong person. The ability to find joy in small things and keep the house tidy helped to maintain sanity. Cheerful stories in the evening, shared activities, and small rituals helped to endure. People understood that despondency could be more dangerous than the cold. Therefore, they maintained their spirits as carefully as they maintained the temperature in the house. The ability to keep their spirits up saved them from cabin fever, which almost everyone was familiar with. It arose from long isolation, monotony, and harsh conditions. But routine, work, and caring for the household left no time for idleness. Every day brought enough to do to keep their minds from dwelling on things. People understood that movement was the best cure for melancholy. This is what helped them maintain their inner balance. These people did not consider themselves heroes, even though their lifestyle required incredible resilience. They simply lived where they saw an opportunity for the future. The land they were developing was harsh, but it gave them a chance to build a home and a future. The cold became part of the price they were willing to pay for independence. They dreamed of freedom and knew that it would not come easily. Therefore, difficulties were perceived as a natural price to pay. The cold was the price of freedom and the opportunity to have a home, even if it stood in the middle of a vast, windswept plain. For the people of that time, the feeling of having their own space was more important than extra comfort. Their choice was dictated not by convenience, but by the desire for independence. Many understood that their lives would become the foundation for future generations, and this gave them the strength to endure hardship. Winter became part of the common journey. Their experience teaches us that people are capable of enduring much more than they think. True endurance is formed not in warmth, but in moments of trial. Comfort is a variable concept that depends on the era and conditions. Warmth is not only physical degrees, but also a feeling of security, comfort, and support from loved ones. People in the past knew how to find this warmth even in the simplest things. It helped them survive the harshest winters. Today, we can only admire their resilience as we look at old photographs of snow-covered huts. Their methods seem primitive, but in reality, they were surprisingly accurate and well thought out. Simplicity often reflected wisdom gained through years of observation and practice. They defeated the cold not with technology, but with ingenuity, effort, and patience. And this victory speaks more to the strength of the human spirit than any modern conveniences. The history of the conquest of the Wild West is not only about shootouts and gold rushes, but also about the quiet feat of daily survival in inhuman conditions. Every warm night was a small victory over the ruthless nature. These people proved that human warmth, literally and figuratively, can melt even the most fierce ice. What modern conveniences do you think have made us weaker? And could we survive today using only the methods of the pioneers? Write about which aspect of the early settlers' lives you would like to learn about in the next video. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because there are still many untold stories of the frontier ahead of us.